In 1915, we leave our country. We come Yerevan. 8 days we walk, and we didn't have nothing to eat. Children crying. I can say that.
Well, the issue that you raised, the first issue is the issue of the human rights, and the April 24th, 1915 event is called a genocide, and that is a word which has been accepted by international bodies such as the United Nations, and there's a very specific definition of the word genocide. It's a crime against humanity, and that genocide was planned and it was perpetrated by the government of Turkey at that time, sometimes called the Young Turks. And their plan was to rid all of the Ottoman Empire of the Armenians in order to eliminate what they perceived as a political problem. And so there were about 2 million Armenians, plus Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire, and they succeeded in a period of about 7 to 8 years in eliminating 90%, 95% of the Armenians in that area.
And what was the reason for hating is a very difficult one. Some say it was religion.
Armenians declared themselves Christians in around 300 AD, and they professed to be the first sovereign state to do so. That as a nation, they were Christians.
The area that we say that the genocide took place had been Armenian for about 3,000 years. And so when the genocide took place, it really eliminated a civilization and a culture which had a 3,000-year history. One of the policies of the government was also to put Kurdish tribes into the areas where the Armenians lived in order to dilute the Armenian majorities. There's some evidence that there has been German complicity in the planning because the German High Command was trying to integrate Turkey into the war effort, and therefore they also believed that the deportations would eliminate a problem, that is the Armenians. There were about 1 million Armenians that lived in the Russian Empire at the time of World War I, and about 2 million that lived in the Ottoman Empire. So when the war broke out and Turkey actually attacked Russia first, that war area was an area that Armenians were right in the middle of.
The Germans definitely helped in the organization of the massacres, the deportations, the manner in which militarily things were going to be set up.
The biggest Armenian community was in the capital, Constantinople, today called Istanbul. And the leadership of the Armenians was captured and arrested on the night of April 23rd, the morning of April 24th. And they were then taken out of the city and murdered.
բացատրենք
The High
շարունակենք։
Soup was explaining how, beginning in 1915, the government of Turkey, the Turkish government at the time, planned systematically to wipe out the Armenians within its boundaries. When we commemorate, for instance, April 24th, 1915, that day was not chosen randomly, but it was the day that Armenian intellectuals and leaders of the community were rounded up and killed in Turkey. It made it, as the Hayastan explains, that made the plan much more easily carried out, because with the leadership of the Armenian community dead the first day, it was much easier then to do away, to deport, to drive into the desert, to be then murdered and buried into mass graves into the desert, the rest of the Armenian people. At that time, the Armenian clergymen, as today, were among the most, if not the most, educated, strongest leaders of the Armenian community. Armenians didn't have their own government at the time. The clergy acted as the Armenian government and the Armenian national leadership. So amongst those few thousand, he explains that 1,000 were done away with. The descriptions were so vicious that many he can't even explain today, but beaten viciously, maimed, cut up, tied up and paraded around their community. Once the message went down to the lower level Turks who were actually going to do the murdering, these Turks had a very strong feeling of Islam. And so they almost considered it, correct me if I'm wrong, Hayastan, considered it their religious responsibility to so violently, so brutally kill the Armenian, especially the clergymen who represent this awful religion that they want to wipe from their land.
But it was later on, in the 30s, that the Germans started again, and this time they did it to the Jews, the same thing, the genocide, which sometimes I think about it and I say the Jews learned nothing from the Armenian genocide, but then that wasn't their fault either.
There were more than 2,500 churches, Armenian churches in Ottoman Turkey. And most of those were destroyed or converted to barns or other kinds of things, to mosques in that period. And the priests were killed as well because they also were a source of leadership. So what happened is that the males first were taken, males between 18 and 45 were drafted into the army and then put into labor battalions. They were disarmed, put into labor battalions, and simply worked until they died. So the male population was basically eliminated. And then what happened is the women and children and the older men were deported, and many died on the deportation routes. The reason for the deportations, as given by the Turkish government, was to protect the Armenians in the war, because this was during World War I, by moving them to safe zones, that is, out of areas of conflict, and then after the war to move them back and resettle them in their homes. The Kurds were settled in the areas where the Armenians lived. They were Muslim by religion, but they were not Turkic by ethnic culture or race. But during the genocide, they were enlisted by the Turkish government to assist in the genocide, and they also participated in the killings and the deportation. However, we must say that there were several Kurdish tribes that actually assisted and helped Armenians escape the genocide, as well as there were some Turks that also helped.
She says the Arabs and the Turks are different. The Arabs were protectors to them, and the Turks perpetrated genocide on them. She said the Turks sent all the Armenians out into the wilderness. She said it's just a desert, and it's impossible to survive, nearly impossible to survive. And the idea was to exterminate all of the Armenians. And if it weren't for the kindness of some of the Arab peoples, not one would have survived.
The Christian government, big one, they don't want smart people like Armenians live in Turkey. So they back them up. They tell, whatever you want, do with the Armenians. Christian people, United States, English, England, French. I blame everything on Christian government. From my father's and grandfather's aunt, we went, this is years before, we went to some place. And they were building, making lumber, making everything to build a house, you know. One is hammering, one is sewing, and this and that. One is making... and there was a girl sitting a little bit on the, talking with my sister. And she was saying, you know, Mayram, she said, we are building these things, but I had a dream, she said, we're not going to enjoy this, somebody else.
She's saying she thinks that the Turkish people did this because the Armenians were industrious and they're the ones that had property and things. They were hardworking people, so they perpetrated this on the Armenians.
Same thing.
So they could take their belongings.
At the time they said that ever since anybody that's over 5, they can remember what's happening, you kill them all. So they took my brothers. And
that was the last time you saw your brothers?
Yeah, that's the last time I saw them. Of course I saw
later she saw them.
Later. And then next day they moved us, next day the women folks, they are just like cattle, hump, you know. They came and passed from the door, or the missionaries' place door. They were all taking them away, yeah. So, but I didn't see my mother, but there was lots of people. They were just talking, just like you take the sheep or cow herd, you know. And, well, I didn't see them anymore.
Her mother had to leave her on the side of the road because they couldn't take her on the road on the deportation. They came back for her.
3 times she put me on the rock so I could drown in the water. When I hollered, I had a big voice.
And so when you hollered, who
then
came to your help?
My mother came and took me again,
Came back.
poor lady. But they told me, go get that girl. If he makes a lot of noise, then the enemy knows where we are. I went through it. What we eat, we had 3 months we walked from here to San Francisco. That's how much we walked. 3 months.
Well,
we ran away.
When you were in Turkey, you walked for 3 months that far?
From Van to Yerevan.
And my grandmother and grandfather, the Dermagradicians that came from Van, my grandmother went through the genocide because she lived in Van.
Yeah.
And the Armenians in Van had resisted against the genocide, and then they were able to withdraw with the Russian army and back through Russia, and then that's how they came to California.
For 30 days, as the story goes, they fought off 5,000 Turkish soldiers, 1,500 Armenians in Van, and then the Soviet troops came, if I understand correctly, and then
they did help a little bit.
Then they pushed the Turkish soldiers away. They went away, the Soviet troops went back, and then the Turkish came back into Van, and then that's when they started burning churches and everything.
That walk to Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia. The Turks could not believe a small group in Van could put up such a fight. So they would get the older Armenians by gathering them in a barn and throw kerosene around the barn and kill everybody that was in there. The Turks would also use the girls by making them undress completely and dance in the nude, and then abuse their bodies. Some were pregnant, and the Turks would tear open their stomachs and take the unborn child out of their mother's stomach with a sword and kill them.
Yeah, my mother-in-law's mother had gone to town one day, and they had taken the babies from the mothers and boiled them and fed them to them.
Oh.
She got real sick. She lost her whole family there. Yeah, and my folks walked with her brother, and they walked for 13 days to get to Yerevan, and my mother buried her baby. Malnutrition, she didn't have enough food on the road.
One day they came to my grandfather's ranch. We were there wintertime. 2 gendarmes came, and boy, they closed the door, kitchen door, you could hear with their guns hitting my father and my grandfather.
You heard them?
And you know, they even poisoned the dogs. They poisoned my grandfather's dog, and that dog never did come to the door, you know. But that day, he was half in the kitchen and half outside, dead. My sister said, pass by, but don't touch. I was holding my sister's hand and my finger was like this. Boy, I touched that dog. Then I left.
Երբ որ վերադարձել են ալիևս, քիչմը խաղաղեր է, զինացուր եղեր է, ըսեր է Հայաստան, գեսուրիս անունը Հայաստան է, Հայաստան ըսեր է, ես քեզի դեսա եկար, չիրու չամիչ լեցուցիր, բզդիկներուտ տարիր ըսեր է, բայց ըսեր է աղ ու հաց ունին կսեր է, քեզի չմերցուցի ես ըսեր է.
She explains that her mother-in-law, Baron Sahak's mother, explained to her the whole story.
Yeah.
And to start out, I find it very interesting that her name was Hayastan, which means Armenia. So Sahak's mother's name was Armenia. So even then, the identity with Armenia was so strong amongst the people, even as they lived next door and together with the Turks. When the genocide was starting in their town, she was living next to a Turkish family, and she ran over to them for something or other, and just at the time she was there, she happened to see the Turkish man of the house what do you call it, Surel? The knife, sharpening a knife very sharply, and he was holding down a young Armenian woman, a maiden, and was telling her, "Don't worry, I'm getting it so sharp that you won't even feel it." And she witnessed, Baron Sahak's mother witnessed then him immediately cutting this woman's head off, and she was shocked, and she said, "Well, what are you doing? How can you be doing this?" "Don't worry," the Turkish man said, "I won't do it to you because you've got food in your house." Apparently, they would be neighborly and share food with each other.
One of the things that he kept mentioning that Roxanne didn't say is the word mortel in Armenian. It is very much associated with the Turks. Mortel means that you cut their throats. It's the most vicious and barbaric way of killing somebody, and the Turks are known for that. Armenians were
Mortel literally means to skin somebody,
to cut
to skin somebody, but they used it as the meaning of, basically skinning, cutting the throat.
That's how they killed the Armenians in those neighborhoods where Mr. Sahak was living.
I, Gabriel, and Mother kept walking day and night, struggling for survival. My mother would keep wrapping our feet with pieces of cloth because they were so raw and bleeding. One day, a Russian soldier, a Cossack, was going by on his horse, and my mother pleaded with him to take me to a safe camp. I didn't want to leave my mother, but the soldier understood my mother and put me on his horse. I kept crying, "Mighty, mighty," which is mother, mother. She yelled, "I will meet up with you in Yerevan. I will find you. Please go." It took all day to reach to the camp where the Armenians had gathered. They gave me food and blanket, and the Russian soldier left. I told the people around me that I couldn't go on and that I had to wait for my mother and my brother. I started to cry, "Mighty, mighty, where are you?" I was all alone all day. And as it was turning dark on the road, I suddenly saw my mother and brother among all the people walking. It was again a miracle, and my strong faith was still with me. There was a lot of happy tears then. We finally got to Yerevan.
I don't know, did you get the message that after the war was over, all the orphans were gathered up and taken to their respective hometowns so that hopefully they could be found? So all the Trabzon sees one back to Trabzon. That's how she and her one brother, the older one who bit the Turk's hand, that's how they got together. And then eventually, after that, someone who knew them and knew they had an uncle here brought them to America.
As we say in colloquial English, the bottom line is Turkey did not succeed. It did not succeed in its plans. When it destroyed our churches, when it destroyed our institutions, it could not destroy, he says, our spirit as a nation, our spirit as a people that rose up again and rebuilt those churches, rebuilt those institutions, and the world is witness to what happened then, and it's witness to what happened now in our rebuilding of our nation and our people.
Now the question is, the current government of Turkey does not want to recognize that there was a genocide because they know that what the ramifications would be. So their policy today in the last 15 or 20 years has been to actively deny the genocide. And in order to deny the genocide, you need to get academic people in academics and universities to publish materials which tend to cast doubt on the genocide. And this is what the Turkish government is doing by trying to establish chairs at places like Portland State University and other places by paying the universities $1 million each, let's say, to hire professors who will in some way teach materials and do research which will tend to support the official position.
The formation of the Institute for Turkish Studies in 1982 became the springboard for its denials. They have highly skilled and educated scholars, many of them well-placed at places like Princeton, Harvard. So when these places become the locus of denial literature, it takes a level of credibility which changes the nature of the process of denial and elevates it to a fraudulent platform that gives it the aura of a legitimate discussion and legitimate debate.
The U.S. isn't going to help the Armenian revive and open up the case again about the genocide because we have a big air base, a place where we can be a watchdog over, say, Iran and Iraq. And we pay the Turks, I don't know, something like maybe a couple of $1 billion a year for the lease of those lands.
Well, the United States, of course, has historically been, since 1915, the one country that has the ability to formally declare the genocide of the Armenians as a historical fact, even though it has been declared so by a number of international bodies. The United States, more than any other country, has probably the best documentation on the Armenian genocide. We had U.S. consuls located throughout Turkey. Ambassador Morgenthau himself was situated in Turkey. And remember, we were neutral at the time in 1914, 1915, 1916. In a letter that was written to the State Department in 1996, I believe it was, or 97, I can't remember. One congressman wrote to Madeleine Albright asking for a clarification of U.S. policy with regard to the recognition of the Armenian genocide. And the response he got from her office was that the interests of the United States militarily and strategically and economically in its relationship with Turkey are such that it could not jeopardize these, in spite of the fact that it certainly sympathizes with the Armenians and recognizes the horrendous massacres to which they were exposed. This is not an Armenian-Turkish issue. I mean, if you read the United Nations document from 1985, there was a speech given by the member of the Federation for Human Rights, And one of the things he said in his speech, that the Armenian Genocide is part of our collective memory and consciousness. To deny the genocide harms us all, and we have a right and a moral obligation to ensure the genocide is taught and not forgotten, because to forget it and to ignore it is to give a purpose to the perpetrators.
The issue of the genocide has been developing, especially in the last 10 years, where, and just recently, where, for instance, France, the Senate in France has acknowledged the genocide. In other countries, there's going to be increased pressure on the United States to fall in line with that. And I think things will change, and they eventually will acknowledge the genocide in an international forum.
So how can the others say that it didn't happen? What happened to those people?
We have a professor who comes to our table, memorial table, in April 24th and tells us what he thinks, right? And this professor is a professor of modern Turkish history.
Imagine this individual standing before us as a group, literally shouting, these things, you stupid Armenians, Armenians, there never was a genocide, but I wish there was, you lying pigs. Armenians deserve to be massacred.
And if the professors are thinking this way, and we are striving for recognition of the Armenian genocide, it's hard to do that when all the major universities in America are teaching otherwise. And the students who learn from them learn that the genocide didn't happen, or if it did happen, it was a part of a civil war. Right? People died because of the internal war that was going on right there.
Despite what anybody might say, I think for an instant we all felt really very small. I mean, the professor achieved some measure of success in doing so. That feeling of smallness, I think, turned to a feeling of anger.
My grandfather had died the weekend before that, and his whole family of 30 was massacred. He was thrown in a pile of dead bodies and miraculously survived. And so, by pure luck, I exist. And this guy is saying, you, your family, everyone should have died. You can't just go on perpetuating the hate. At one point in time, you got to say, enough's enough. You just got to settle down and deal with it. And then when you have, a government, trying to persuade people that this genocide never happened, it makes it more difficult. I mean, what do? You're constantly under attack.
You go to public school and you get educated about the history of prejudice against other groups, African Americans, Hispanics, the Chinese, but really in some sense we remain kind of ignorant about the history of prejudice directed against our own people, because there's at most 1 or 2 sentences about the Armenian Genocide in most history books. It really is, one of the greatest crimes committed against humanity. I don't think anyone would disagree with me if they actually did reading on a genocide.
You have to consider where these people are coming from. They're in a country where if they say what is not allowed by the country, they'll get shot. These people, Armenians say, oh, the Turks this, the Turks that. To go and just say, oh, I'm going to convince a Turk to think this, it's difficult. In my own thinking, I think the deeper root is the government has to be reformed almost. If you don't have free speech, how are you going to change your opinion? How are you going to change your mind?
I do know a few Turks that I'm friends with, and they hold views similar to the Armenians that in fact it was genocide. There have been problems with Turks coming forward. You have to understand that there is not that much dissent allowed in Turkey and even in this country. The Las Vegas newspaper in 1986 published a very long article by a Turk called Longing to Stop the Bleeding. It was an article in which he wrote about the personal shame and pain that he felt that his government still denies the Armenian genocide. But the consequence of him having published that was that he became the target of a great deal of animus, hatred, personal threats to himself and his family. He ended up moving, actually, out of Las Vegas as a result of this.
Well, one of the obstacles currently to Turkish entrance into the European common market has been the genocide issue. So that is a very concrete obstacle to their economic progress. I think that the recognition of the genocide and restitution would be very positive for the Turkish people. And it's the Turkish government which is refusing to do this, to recognize the genocide, but pressure must be brought to bear on them to do that.
A great part of the pain of the survivors and descendants of the survivors is in the denial process. Healing cannot begin until acknowledgement comes. And that's true with the victims of the Holocaust. That's true with them as it is for the Armenians. And still, it does not heal the memories of those who know what happened in the Holocaust, who have personal relationships with people who survived the Holocaust. Still, the healing begins at the point where acknowledgement comes.
Mom, I'm making this film about the Armenian people and what happened to them and why they had to leave their homeland. I'm trying to resolve all of this conflict that's happened between the Turkish people and the Armenian people, to see if these two groups of people could once again live peacefully with each other. I don't know if I'm able to do this or not, but we'll try.